Millionaire CEO interviews a single mother. By mistake, what she did next shocked everyone. Ethan Mendez had already stood up from his chair when the silence stopped him. The interview should have been over. Another decision checked off his schedule. Another name forgotten by the end of the day. This was just business clean and predictable. Exactly how he liked it. But something about the woman still sitting across from him made the room feel heavier than it should. He couldn't explain why he hadn't spoken yet, only that leaving suddenly felt wrong. He was a self-made millionaire CEO. Single, no children, no personal distractions. A man who trusted systems more than instincts. People often said he was efficient to the point of being cold, and he never corrected them. His life worked because he didn't hesitate, because he didn't second guess. But in that moment, hesitation crept in quietly, uninvited, and that alone unsettled him. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you haven't. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. Lisa Benson sat with her folder resting on her lap, unaware her life had already begun to tilt. She wasn't trying to impress, wasn't performing confidence, just answering carefully, honestly, the way survival had taught her. There was exhaustion in her eyes she didn't hide, and dignity in the way she carried it. Lisa was a beautiful African-American woman, whose presence commanded respect without demanding it. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly, and though her suit was a few years old, she wore it with the kind of grace that came from knowing her worth wasn't tied to what she owned. She had learned not to expect kindness in rooms like this. She was already preparing herself for the familiar ending. Ethan glanced at the clock, then back at her, sensing something didn't add up. The interview hadn't followed the script, and neither had she. Protocol told him to end it politely and move on without complication. Something deeper told him this moment mattered, even if he didn't know why yet. And once he noticed that feeling, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Because whatever he said next would quietly change 2 lives. Not through power, not through money, not through obligation, but through a choice that looked small from the outside. A pause that wasn't supposed to exist, and a decision he would remember. Ethan Mendez had built his entire life around structure, discipline, and predictability. And it showed in everything he touched. His office overlooked the city like a controlled observation point, quiet, clean, almost impersonal. Being single and without children had never felt like a loss to him, only a logical consequence of ambition. Work had always come first, and it had rewarded him generously for that loyalty. Emotional distance felt like a fair trade for success. Lisa Benson lived in a rhythm shaped by school schedules, grocery lists, and constant mental calculations. Every decision passed first through one question: whether it was good for her 6-year-old daughter Nancy. She had lost her previous job after a sudden restructuring and had been navigating uncertainty ever since. Interviews came and went. Savings thinned quietly, and optimism required effort she rarely talked about. Still, she showed up prepared, believing effort had to matter eventually. That morning had started early, like most of her days. She had kissed Nancy goodbye at school and promised she would try again today. There was no drama in her struggle, just persistence and the quiet fear of time running out. Lisa double-checked the address, followed the instructions carefully, and trusted the number she'd been given. There was no reason to suspect anything could go wrong. Ethan, meanwhile, was under pressure of his own, even if it looked very different from Lisa's. The company was growing fast, and growth exposed weaknesses he could no longer ignore. He needed someone reliable, someone grounded, someone who could see beyond surface-level solutions. Trust did not come easily to him, especially in environments where confidence often hid incompetence. That was why he insisted on leading this interview himself. When Lisa walked into the building, nothing felt out of place to her. The lobby was busy, modern, filled with people who seemed certain of where they belonged. She checked in, followed directions, and was escorted upstairs without question. A recently updated company number had quietly rerouted her call to the wrong department. No one noticed the error yet, but it was already shaping what came next. Inside the interview room, tension lingered just beneath the surface. Ethan sensed early on that something didn't align with the role he was hiring for. Lisa sensed the difficulty of the questions, but assumed it was part of the process. Neither interrupted the flow, both too focused to question it. And with every minute that passed, the conversation moved them closer to a moment neither could anticipate. The interruption came softly, almost apologetically, a knock that didn't match the weight of what it carried. Ethan's assistant stepped into the room with a tablet in her hands and hesitation in her voice. She glanced at Lisa, then back at Ethan, clearly unsure how to say what needed to be said. There had been a scheduling issue, she explained. Something about a recent update to the company's contact system. A call had been redirected to the wrong department earlier that morning. Ethan felt the shift immediately. The moment when understanding replaces confusion. This interview wasn't supposed to be happening. Not like this. Not with her. The candidate he was waiting for was still downstairs, sitting in a different room entirely. For a brief second, the rules of the world snapped back into place. Order could be restored with a simple apology and a polite goodbye. Lisa's face changed as the words settled in. There was no anger in her expression, only embarrassment and quiet disappointment. She realized she hadn't misunderstood the questions. She had misunderstood the entire situation. The mistake wasn't hers, but the weight of it landed on her anyway. She had learned long ago that fairness didn't always matter in moments like this. She closed her folder carefully, as if trying not to make noise. Her voice was calm when she apologized, even though she didn't know one. She thanked Ethan for his time and stood up slowly, already preparing herself for the familiar sting. Another door closed, another opportunity lost before it could even begin. She told herself she would explain it gently to Nancy later. Ethan watched her movements more closely than he meant to. There was no frustration, no pleading, no attempt to salvage something that wasn't promised, just dignity, restraint, and an acceptance that felt earned, not defeated. That unsettled him far more than anger would have. It forced him to confront the human cost of simple procedural mistakes. The assistant clarified again that the company number had been updated only days earlier. Several calls had been misrouted since then, including Lisa's. This was a systems failure, not a personal one. Ethan nodded, hearing the explanation, but focused somewhere else entirely. Rules existed for a reason, but so did judgment. Lisa paused near the door, waiting for his final word. She didn't expect anything more, and that expectation showed. Her shoulders were already bracing for the walk back down. Ethan felt time slow, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The choice in front of him was small, yet strangely heavy. Lisa stood near the door for a moment longer than necessary, not because she expected something to change, but because leaving always felt heavier than arriving. Her mind had already shifted into survival mode, calculating how she would explain another failed interview without breaking the fragile sense of hope her daughter carried. She reminded herself that the mistake had not been hers, even if it would still cost her the same way. Moments like this were never loud or dramatic. They were quiet, almost polite, and that made them harder. She reached for the handle with the kind of calm that only comes from repeated disappointment. Ethan watched her from across the room, feeling an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. He had made countless decisions that affected people's lives, But rarely did he see the consequence standing right in front of him. Lisa was not arguing, not negotiating, not asking for mercy or exceptions. She was simply absorbing the loss and preparing to move forward because she had no other option. That quiet resilience forced him to confront the distance he usually kept from outcomes like this. Lisa finally turned back to face him, offering a small, respectful smile that felt undeserved. She thanked him again. Even though gratitude was the last thing she truly felt in that moment, her thoughts drifted to Nancy, to the backpack waiting by the door at home, to the promise she had made that morning. She wondered how many more times she could say she tried before the word lost its meaning. The room felt too large now, as if it had already moved on without her. Ethan's instincts told him to follow protocol, to let the process continue as designed. Structure had built his success, and emotion had always been something he managed carefully from a distance. Yet something about Lisa's composure disrupted that balance in him. She wasn't fragile, but she was exposed, standing there without any safety net. For the first time, the rules felt insufficient. Lisa stepped fully into the hallway, already halfway gone emotionally. The elevator doors down the hall reflected her image back at her, smaller than she felt inside. She straightened her posture, a habit formed from years of needing to look capable, even when she felt uncertain. There was no one she could call to say it went wrong again. This was something she would carry alone, as she always had. Ethan rose from his chair slowly, aware that time was passing. Every second that ticked by made the decision easier to avoid and harder to face. He could still let her leave and justify it without effort. Nothing in his calendar would change. Nothing in the company would falter immediately. Only one person would feel the weight of that choice. Lisa reached the elevator and pressed the button, her heart sinking as she waited. She told herself that resilience meant not expecting fairness, only persistence. Still, a small part of her felt tired in a way rest could not fix. She wondered if there would ever be a moment when effort and outcome aligned. The doors remained closed, stretching the silence. Behind her, Ethan stood still, caught between habit and conscience. He realized that doing nothing was still a decision, one he would remember. This was not about saving someone or playing hero. It was about acknowledging what he had seen and choosing not to ignore it. And once that thought took hold, he knew he could not unfeel it. The elevator still hadn't opened when Ethan's voice reached Lisa from behind, calm but different than before. He didn't call out loudly. He just said her name the way someone says it when they mean to be understood. Lisa turned, confused, already expecting a polite apology and a quick explanation to close the moment. Ethan's assistant froze near the doorway, sensing he was about to do something unusual, maybe even risky. Ethan asked Lisa to step back inside for one more minute, and he said it like it mattered. Lisa walked back into the room slowly, trying not to look hopeful because hope had embarrassed her too many times lately. She kept her face neutral, her posture steady, and she held her folder like it was an anchor she couldn't lose. Ethan didn't sit right away, which made the room feel less formal and more human than it had minutes ago. He told her directly that the mistake was the company's the number update, the misrouted call, the system failure. Then he paused, as if he was choosing his next words with care instead of speed. Ethan said he couldn't ignore what he'd heard from her, not because it was impressive, but because it was grounded and real. He explained that he still had to interview the candidate who was scheduled, because fairness mattered and process mattered too. But he also said the company had an opening on a different team, an entry-level position with a 90-day trial period. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't a shortcut, and it definitely wasn't charity, because he refused to insult her like that. It was simply a chance to prove what she already seemed to know about herself. Lisa's first reaction wasn't excitement, it was fear. because chances still come with consequences when you have a child at home. She asked about the hours, the pay, the benefits, and whether it would be stable enough to plan around school pickups. Ethan answered in clear terms, and the numbers were modest but honest. A salary that could actually hold a household together. Lisa felt her throat tighten as she realized someone was speaking to her like her life was worth planning, not just surviving. She nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing could make the offer disappear if she moved too fast. Ethan called in the department director who would supervise the trial, a capable woman named Robert with a sharp eye. Robert looked surprised, not rude, but clearly uncertain why the CEO was personally placing someone in her area. Ethan didn't oversell Lisa, and that was important because he didn't want to create resentment before Lisa even started. He simply said Lisa had shown strong instincts, and he wanted her evaluated fairly during the 90-day period. Robert agreed, but her expression said the team would not automatically welcome this. When Lisa stepped into the hallway again, the building felt different. Not because it got warmer, but because she wasn't invisible anymore. She could already picture the morning routine changing, the worry easing slightly, the ability to buy groceries without panic math. At the same time, she could feel the pressure settling in, because a trial period meant she could still lose this. She thought about Nancy's face when she'd said goodbye, and how she deserved a mother who kept trying, even when tired. Lisa signed the initial paperwork with steady hands, but inside she felt like she was stepping onto thin ice. Ethan returned to his schedule, but something had shifted in him too, even if he didn't name it. He told himself it was a rational decision, that good talent should not be lost because of a technical error. Yet he also knew this wasn't only rational, because he had felt something in that room he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched Lisa walk away down the corridor, not with pity, but with an awareness that her life was heavier than his. And for the first time in years, he wondered what it would mean to actually carry something with someone. By the end of the day, the news had already started traveling through the company in quiet, distorted fragments. People noticed when the CEO made an exception, even a small one, and they always filled the gaps with their own stories. Some assumed Lisa had connections, others assumed she was a desperate favor, and a few assumed something more personal. Lisa didn't know any of that yet, but she would, and it would test her in ways skill alone couldn't handle, because the real interview was about to begin, and it wouldn't happen in a conference room. Lisa's first weeks inside the company were quieter than most people expected, and that was intentional on her part. She didn't arrive trying to impress or prove she deserved to be there, because she knew that kind of energy often backfired. Instead, she watched how the team worked, how emails piled up, how decisions stalled, and how frustration spread silently. She listened more than she spoke, taking notes, asking questions that felt harmless but revealed deeper cracks. What she saw wasn't incompetence, just exhaustion and a lack of clear direction. The team she joined had been operating on autopilot for months, covering gaps instead of fixing them. People were used to putting out fires, not preventing them, and that took a toll no spreadsheet could show. Lisa noticed how often ideas were dismissed simply because no one had time to explain them properly. She started small, organizing information, clarifying tasks, and making sure everyone knew what mattered most that day. It wasn't leadership by authority, but by presence, and it slowly changed the atmosphere. Ethan observed all of this from a distance, intentionally keeping himself out of the day-to-day details. He didn't want Lisa to succeed because of him, and he didn't want the team to feel watched or managed from above. Still, reports crossed his desk that looked cleaner, calmer, more focused than before. He noticed fewer last-minute emergencies and fewer tense emails sent late at night. Something was working, even if no one was calling attention to it. Lisa's biggest challenge wasn't the workload, but the unspoken resistance she felt from a few coworkers. Some assumed she was temporary, Others assumed she didn't belong, and a few simply didn't trust change. Instead of confronting them directly, she made space for collaboration, inviting opinions, and sharing credit openly. She made it clear that solutions didn't come from her alone, but from the room. When people felt heard, slowly, defenses lowered, and participation increased. At home, the changes were just as noticeable, though less visible to the outside world. Lisa was less tense when Nancy talked about her day, more present during dinner, less distracted by fear. She could plan a week ahead without panic, knowing her paycheck was coming, at least for now. That stability gave her strength at work, and work gave her strength at home, creating a fragile but real balance. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just reacting to life. She was participating in it. One afternoon, a small issue surfaced that would normally have been ignored until it became a major problem. Lisa gathered the team, not to blame anyone, but to understand the process together. Each person contributed a piece, sharing insights that had never been voiced before. They fixed the issue quickly, and more importantly, they learned how to prevent it next time. The sense of collective ownership changed the way they saw their own roles. Ethan received a summary of that incident later that evening, and something about it stayed with him. Not because of the numbers, but because of the tone: calm, cooperative, effective. He realized Lisa wasn't fighting for recognition or position. She was fighting for people to function better together. That kind of effort didn't create noise, but it created results that lasted. And he began to see that his decision that day had opened a door bigger than he expected. As the 90-day trial moved forward, Lisa felt the weight of it every morning she walked into the building. She knew this was still temporary, still conditional, still fragile. But she also knew she was no longer alone inside those walls. The team had started to trust her, and she trusted them back. What none of them knew yet was how deeply that trust would soon be tested. The real test arrived quietly, without warning, the way the most important moments often do. A long-term client raised concerns about inconsistencies in a report that had already passed through several departments. Normally, this kind of issue would trigger defensiveness, rushed explanations, and quiet finger-pointing behind closed doors. Instead, the tension settled slowly across the floor, heavy but contained, as people waited to see what would happen next. Lisa felt the shift immediately and knew this moment mattered far beyond the numbers on the page. She asked the team to pause all reactions and gather in one room, not to assign blame, but to slow things down. Her voice was calm, steady, and free of urgency, which helped lower the temperature before it could rise. She reminded everyone that the client wasn't the enemy, and that mistakes were signals, not failures. That framing alone changed how people sat in their chairs and looked at one another. For the first time, the problem felt shared instead of personal. As they walked through the process together, gaps appeared that no single person could have seen alone. One analyst noticed a timing issue. Another caught a formatting error. And someone else realized a data source had changed weeks earlier. Lisa didn't take over the conversation. She guided it, making sure every voice was heard and every detail considered. What could have turned into panic became focus, and focus turned into clarity. The solution emerged naturally, built from pieces everyone recognized as their own. While the team worked, word quietly reached Ethan that something was unfolding on the floor. He resisted the urge to step in, trusting the structure he had allowed to form. From his office, he watched through glass walls as people leaned in, collaborated, and stayed present instead of reactive. There was no chaos, no raised voices, no visible stress, only concentration and mutual respect. He realized this was the kind of leadership he rarely saw and never taught. When the revised report went out, The response from the client was immediate and unexpectedly warm. They appreciated not just the correction, but the transparency and care behind it. The crisis dissolved without escalation, leaving relief instead of exhaustion in its wake. The team sat back in their chairs quietly, processing what they had just navigated together. They hadn't just solved a problem. They had proven something to themselves. Lisa felt the weight lift slowly, not as celebration, but as quiet confirmation. She hadn't saved the day alone, and she didn't want credit for that. What mattered to her was that the team had trusted the process and each other. She saw confidence settle into their posture, a sense of capability that hadn't been there before. This was the kind of success that stayed. Ethan asked Lisa to step into his office later that afternoon, and the request made her stomach tighten. She had learned not to assume good news, even when things went well. He didn't speak right away when she entered, which only deepened the tension. Then he told her he had been watching not the outcome, but the way she held the room together. That acknowledgement landed heavier than praise ever could. He told her that leadership wasn't about having the right answers, but about creating space for them to appear. Lisa listened quietly, absorbing words she hadn't realized she needed to hear. For the first time since walking into the building, she felt seen in a way that went beyond performance. Ethan ended the conversation without promises, without guarantees, without changing her status. But something between them had shifted, and both of them knew it. What Lisa didn't realize yet was that this moment had begun rewriting how Ethan understood connection itself. He had spent years believing efficiency mattered more than people. Now, he was starting to question whether the opposite might be true. The trial period was still running, the stakes still high, and the future still uncertain. But something real had already taken root, and it wasn't going away. If this story is touching your heart, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories that remind us goodness still exists in the world. The weeks that followed tested everything the team had quietly built together, not through numbers alone, but through pressure that came from outside their control. A sudden shift in market conditions forced departments to reconsider timelines, budgets, and expectations that had felt stable just days earlier. Meetings grew longer, inboxes filled faster, and uncertainty crept back into conversations that had recently felt confident. Lisa sensed the old patterns, trying to return the instinct to protect oneself instead of the work. She knew this was where trust either deepened or dissolved. At the same time, Lisa's personal life began to feel the strain of the increased demands at work. Nancy's school called one afternoon about a sudden illness, and Lisa had to leave in the middle of an important discussion. She felt the familiar guilt rise, the fear that needing to be a mother would be seen as a weakness she could not afford. When she returned the next day, she expected quiet judgment or subtle distance from the team. Instead, she found her responsibilities covered and her seat waiting. That small act shifted something inside her because it reminded her she was no longer carrying everything alone. She thanked the team, not with formality, but with honesty, explaining why moments like that mattered to her. In return, others began sharing their own constraints, aging parents, children, health worries, lives that existed beyond the office walls. What emerged was not vulnerability for its own sake, but understanding that made collaboration more humane. The work did not slow down, but it softened in ways that made it sustainable. Ethan watched these changes unfold through patterns rather than anecdotes, noticing fewer resignations, fewer quiet burnouts. He saw teams staying late when necessary, not out of fear, but out of shared responsibility. The company's performance held steady despite external pressure, which surprised several board members. When asked about the shift, Ethan struggled to explain it using traditional language. What he was witnessing didn't fit neatly into metrics, but it was undeniably real. A family member of one team member became seriously ill, threatening to derail a major deadline. Instead of reallocating the work coldly, Lisa organized support around that person, adjusting timelines and redistributing tasks carefully. The project was delivered on time, not because of sacrifice, but because people showed up for one another. That moment became a quiet reference point, a reminder of what was possible when empathy guided decisions. It was leadership rooted in care, not control. Ethan requested a broader review of team performance near the end of the trial period, and the results spoke clearly. Productivity had improved, but more importantly, stability had increased across multiple indicators. Employees reported higher clarity, better communication, and a stronger sense of belonging. These were outcomes Ethan had chased for years through policy and structure without success. Now they were emerging from something far simpler and far harder to engineer. When Ethan met with Lisa again, the conversation felt different from their previous exchange. He spoke openly about the challenges the company was facing and the limits of his own experience in navigating them. Lisa listened, recognizing the vulnerability in his admission, even if he didn't label it that way. She responded with perspective rather than advice, framing growth as something that had to include people's lives, not compete with them. The moment felt less like an evaluation and more like a shared reflection. By the end of that meeting, neither of them had said anything about promotions or permanence. Yet both understood that something essential had already changed between them and within the company. Lisa's role had expanded quietly through trust rather than title. Ethan's understanding of leadership had shifted from distance to presence, and the future, while still uncertain, felt grounded in something they could both stand on. The revelation didn't arrive as a dramatic confession or a sudden confrontation, but as something far quieter and more personal. Ethan stayed late one evening, reviewing old internal documents connected to the company's early years, looking for context he hadn't needed before. Among routine files, he came across a handwritten note that had been scanned and archived years earlier, almost forgotten. It was a letter written by his late mother during the period when the company was still fragile and uncertain. He hadn't seen her handwriting in years, and the familiarity stopped him cold. The letter wasn't about money, growth, or ambition, but about people and the cost of losing them along the way. She wrote about watching her son build something remarkable while slowly isolating himself from those around him. She worried that success, if left unchecked, would harden him instead of fulfilling him. One line stood out, written with care and urgency, reminding him that leadership meant staying human even when it felt inefficient. Ethan felt something open inside him that he had kept sealed for a long time. At the same time, Lisa was preparing to leave the office, unaware of what Ethan was reading upstairs. She had just finished helping a colleague work through a difficult conversation with a family member on the phone. The day had been heavy but meaningful, filled with moments that reminded her why she kept choosing patience over fear. She checked the time, thinking about Nancy waiting at home with homework spread across the kitchen table. Life felt full in a way that scared her, because she knew how quickly fullness could disappear. Ethan asked Lisa to meet him briefly before she left, and his tone carried something she hadn't heard before. When she entered his office, she noticed the letter on his desk and the change in his posture. He didn't explain it right away, instead asking her what she believed made people stay in difficult environments. Lisa answered honestly, saying people stayed when they felt seen and when their lives were respected. She didn't know how closely her words echoed the letter in front of him. Ethan shared part of the letter with her, not as a confession, but as context. He admitted that he had built walls to protect the company and himself, believing distance equaled strength. Lisa listened quietly, understanding that this moment was not about her performance or her future role. It was about someone realizing that success without connection felt hollow. The air between them shifted heavier with meaning, but free of expectation. In that space, Ethan told Lisa he had decided to structure her recognition differently. Instead of elevating her alone, he wanted to formalize the collaborative model she had built. He proposed a small equity-based bonus tied to team performance, extending opportunity rather than concentrating it. It wasn't a reward meant to impress, but one meant to last. Lisa felt the weight of trust more than the promise of money. She thought about Nancy, about the future she was quietly shaping without guarantees. She also thought about the people around her, the team that had become a source of strength. Accepting this meant accepting responsibility that reached beyond herself. She agreed, not because it solved everything, but because it aligned with how she wanted to live. That choice sealed something deeper than a contract. Ethan realized in that moment that the letter hadn't been a coincidence. It had surfaced exactly when he was finally ready to hear it. Lisa hadn't changed the company through force or brilliance alone. She had changed it by making room for humanity again. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. The story didn't end with applause or celebration, but with quiet understanding. Both of them knew the transformation wasn't complete, only begun. The past had finally spoken, and the present had answered. What came next would grow from that exchange, and neither of them would walk forward the same way again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt different from anything Lisa had known before. Not easier, but steadier and more honest. She arrived at work knowing what was expected of her and feeling supported rather than tested at every turn. The team moved with more confidence, not because problems disappeared, but because no one felt alone facing them. There was a sense that mistakes could be addressed without fear, and effort would be met with understanding. That shift created space for real growth, both professional and personal. At home, Nancy noticed the change before Lisa did, asking why her mother smiled more during dinner. Lisa realized she wasn't carrying the same tightness in her chest that had followed her everywhere before. She could help with homework without checking her phone every few minutes, could plan weekends without dread. Stability didn't feel like a distant goal anymore, but something fragile and present that deserved care. That awareness made her more intentional with every choice she made. Ethan continued to lead the company, but his presence felt different to those around him, even if they couldn't explain why. He listened more, spoke with less urgency, and asked questions that invited reflection instead of compliance. The changes weren't dramatic enough to make headlines, but they were deep enough to change how people felt coming to work. He found himself leaving the office earlier some evenings, not to escape, but to reclaim parts of life he had ignored. Leadership no longer felt like distance, but responsibility shared. Lisa and Ethan crossed paths often, sometimes discussing work, sometimes exchanging quiet moments of understanding. There was no rush to define what their connection meant, and that absence of pressure allowed it to breathe. Both of them were learning how to exist without armor, even if only in small ways at first. They respected the boundaries that life had drawn, honoring timing as much as feeling. What mattered was the trust that had formed beneath the surface. The team continued to evolve, carrying forward the practices they had built together. New employees sensed it immediately, the openness, the clarity, the absence of fear that usually lingered in growing companies. Lisa made sure the culture didn't depend on her presence alone, encouraging others to lead in their own way. That decision ensured the transformation would outlast any single role or person. It was the kind of success that didn't need constant protection. One afternoon, Lisa received a message from her sister suggesting a casual dinner later that week. There was no explanation, just a light invitation that felt intentionally vague. Lisa smiled, sensing something playful beneath the simplicity, but choosing not to question it. Life had taught her that not every surprise needed to be anticipated. Some moments were better experienced as they arrived. Ethan received a similar invitation from a mutual acquaintance he hadn't heard from in a while. He hesitated before accepting, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliar openness. The idea of stepping into something undefined no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a continuation of the changes already underway inside him. He agreed, curious rather than guarded. As the story moved forward, nothing was neatly resolved or perfectly framed. There were still challenges ahead, still uncertainties waiting quietly in the background. But something fundamental had shifted in how these lives intersected and supported one another. Healing hadn't arrived through grand gestures or dramatic victories. It had grown slowly through choices made with care. The ending didn't close every door or answer every question. Instead, it offered something gentler and more lasting, the sense that people could change without losing themselves. Lisa, Ethan, and the team carried that truth forward, shaping lives rooted in connection rather than fear. The future remained open, not as a risk, but as a possibility. And that was enough. Thanks for watching. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what part of the story resonated with you most. Your words remind us why we share these stories, because goodness is still alive in the world, and it deserves to be celebrated.